envy you becoming a woman out here. No rules, no worries, or whispers about what you should be. There's no such thing as freedom, Elsa. Don't anyone tell you there is. There's laws, there's rules, there's customs, responsibilities everywhere. The more people you cram together, the more rules there'll be. I don't know what life is like in Oregon, but there'll be rules there too. This trail is as free as you'll ever be. The only rules you need to follow are the ones in your heart. The words from Margaret Dutton, the matriarch of the Dutton family, played by Faith Hill, are probably something that a lot of us, think about, especially in today's world. What is freedom? Is what I like to think of as the main question of this episode, and of course, the title suggests the same. It's the Fangs of Freedom. We see freedom as something that's hard to find, but it is also, a core tenet of Western democracy. And those of us who call small towns or the vast expanses of the American West home typically are people who value freedom just a little bit more. And that's not to say that our friends in the cities don't, but there's something specifically aspirational about trying to find freedom in places where there are no laws or very little, where accountability comes from yourself and self-reliance is key to survival. The allure of freedom in this country to hunt, to fish, drive whatever you want as fast as you want, shoot whatever you want, and more is something that a lot of us hold very dear, and it's something that is not necessarily the case in a lot of the world. So we also have to balance that with what are the dangers of freedom, and I think that's kind of the impetus of today's episode, the discussion point, if you will. And so we'll get right into that right after a quick word from our sponsors. Throughout time, people have clustered together to create societies with like-minded values. There's so many risks if disaster strikes and you're all on your own or far away from help. There's all kinds of statistics that suggest if you grow up in a small town, your life expectancy may be lower. Typically, that comes from a range of reasons. Obviously, access to medical care is not always close at hand. There's more accidents because of the self-reliance of trying to do things like build your own home or work the land or, interactions with wildlife and other things. So, people try and create societies and group together because obviously there's a core tenet of being a human is that there's strength in numbers. And, Enlightenment era philosophers like Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, and others always contemplated what was the perfect balance between freedom and security. And I think that, it's not a discussion that ultimately has a right answer. And even if it does have a right answer, I think the right answer is always evolving, right? Situationally, when you think about different aspects and different time periods in history, as someone who views themselves as a conservative, I typically like to value freedom more than security in most cases, but I completely understand why it exists. Things like speed limits, wearing your seatbelt. I've learned growing up to always wear a seatbelt, and it seems instinctual. Sometimes I go to get in my car just to sit in it if I'm at an outdoor event, and it seems like I'm unconsciously putting my seatbelt on, right? Because we have society-wide questions and debates and discussions about what that balance is, but then we also have ones within ourselves. And, because of these fleeting ideas, these fleeting theories, it's something that should always be contemplated. And, this may be a small example, but when you think about freedom on a daily basis, there's not nearly as much freedom as our characters were faced with in the 1883 series. Obviously, they could essentially do whatever they wanted. There was really no laws. Once you got out on the trail, there were only agreements. And, if you think back to episode 1, when James is being pursued by the bandits or even gets his wallet stolen in town, he doesn't have the luxury of, pursuing the authorities in the area. It's life or death. It's, if he loses his wallet or he loses his horses, those are his ways of surviving. So even though he has the freedom to pursue these things, he also has the responsibilities to protect himself and his property. And I think that what we see is that the immigrants are learning this, right? They're learning that although the allure of freedom for them might be freedom from persecution or freedom from tyrannical government, or even just freedom to build a new life with more land, that freedom doesn't just affect the pure of heart, that it also attracts the villains of society, the outlaws, the people who don't do well within security because they do not agree with the terms of society. And, one thing that I like to talk to people about a lot is that when you think about humans, obviously we have progressed from 1,000 years ago, mainly because of the advent of things, of learning materials and whatnot, like books, and now, of course, the internet. We can learn a lot quicker. It's hard to advance, right, when every day all you're trying to do is survive. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs, says that the bottom is the most basic needs are food, water, and shelter. But when you get past those, that's when you start learning. That's when you start growing and developing. But we have to remember that we're still not that far off inherently from those people born 1,000 years ago. I mean, if you today were born on a remote island, your views of the world would be not too dissimilar from those of our ancestors. And so when you look at what happens in a lawless place like the trail, is you see kind of a real life debate occur about what is freedom, what do we need to sacrifice for our security, and that's what we get into in episode 5 of 1883. So the episode, of course, begins with Ennis and Elsa and Wade herding the cattle across the Brazos River. And, of course, in the previous episode that we talked about, the immigrant train had made its way across the river, and there had been quite a bit of destruction, death, issues at large with the crossing. And, typically animals take care of themselves in situations like this, but accidents, of course, do happen, especially with the large numbers of cattle that were crossing. And I actually found an article on NBC's DFW affiliate where they were talking about the crossing at the Pecos River, which is on the Goodnight Loving Trail, and the issues that occurred there. So historian Patrick Deerin had a book called Crossing the River Pecos. And basically, there's a line in there that recounts the experiences of some of the folks that made the trip, and it says that you could see thousands upon thousands of cattle laying dead about the Pecos, while all the road was white with fleshless bones. That was noted by Stephen Powers, who traveled the trail across the river in 1868 and actually almost died himself. Another story said that many great droves had arrived here before us, and some of the frenzied animals had rushed headlong into the glittering pools of alkali and quaffed the crystal death, falling where they stood. Of course, talking about how bad water can also kill your cattle. But, there were all kinds of issues. I mean, another traveler said that there were just tons of rotting carcasses at the Horsehead crossing, and that we see the dead cattle floating down while we are dipping up the water and see them lying on the banks all over. This is what we will have to drink for 87 miles. So not only did the river pose a danger when crossing, but also if it's the only source of water within miles and it's tainted by the dead cattle or even humans that are within it, I mean, it's just an absolutely atrocious thing to think of. Another thing that plagued the folks that crossed the Pecos, of course, was Indian attacks at the Horsehead crossing. And there's a quote from one traveler that says, "During the last year, I am informed that every drove of cattle intended for the U.S. Army posts in New Mexico were captured when passing this place." And he was referring to, of course, that Pecos River crossing. And he was actually the U.S. Army post commander in Fort Stockton in the 1860s. Of course, that same year, 1867, Loving, who was Charles Goodnight's partner, actually died because of being attacked by the Comanches. So, our travelers in 1883 are also worried about Indian predation. When they realize that they're getting weaker, their numbers are waning, and they have to worry about not only Indians, but also bandits, outlaws, thieves along the trail. So, unfortunately for them, though, there are actually much more immediate concerns. And that's where we see Captain Brennan Shea talking to Thomas about how, they're losing folks. After the river crossing, there were too many orphans and too many widows, as Captain Brennan said. And they also lost a lot of food and supplies in the river. So, when you think about what are the dangers, we've talked about the dangers before: illness, the death that came from river crossings. There was also, human nature was a major danger on the trail. And we see this kind of play out when Shea and Thomas are trying to talk to Joseph, who's the only German who can speak English and can interpret, and says that they talk to him and find out that there's actually a food thief amongst them, and they actually try to confront the thief, and Joseph gets beat up. So again, even when we're talking about our own people, if we're in the wagon train, I mean, fever pitch levels of anger and tension occur over things that we wouldn't even expect. I mean, you kind of feel like you're alone out there with only your people that are also in the trail there to protect you, and all of a sudden it kind of becomes every man for himself. And like I said earlier, freedom doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. We all have an idea of what are the boundaries, what is acceptable, what is not. And in a lawless land like this, things like stealing have to be dealt with severely and have to be agreed upon. And one of the things I found really interesting is that these wagon trains would typically kind of sit down and almost like, the Mayflower Compact. They would all, before they embarked on the trip, they would kind of write a constitution, if you will, of what they agreed upon as the laws of the trail. And True West, which is an online resource that has plenty of articles and little blurbs around what went on in the American West throughout the 1800s, had a pretty cool article on thieves. And so I'll read a little bit of that. It says that immigrants heading west in their covered wagons usually had a wagon master, and they knew the trails and they had the experience to get through the trials and travails of trail safety. Now that's quite the sentence right there. Knew the trails and had the experience to get through the trials and travails of the trail safely. And pity those immigrants who didn't go with the experience and history that tells us that there were many of those who did not have the knowledge they needed. Therefore, it was the wagon master's job to maintain discipline and ensure that everyone survived on the trip. So the stress and strain of the journey would cause many of them to break. And in 1852, it turned out to be the biggest and busiest year for wagon trains heading west. And of course, that was the destination of Willamette Valley, Oregon, where we find our folks in 1883 trying to head just 30 years later. Following the American custom of self-government, they usually elected a council that held court for breaches of discipline. Usually, the wagon master acted as judge, but it also might be a preacher or some other respected traveler. These transgressions included such things as politics, religion, morals, family disputes, theft, and of course, stealing women. Other things known to split parties of immigrants were the speed of travel, disputes over routes, and the treatment of animals. The usual punishment for serious breach of discipline, such as rape or murder, was typically banishment, fire squad, or hanging. It was estimated that the peak year of wagon travel, no less than 50 murders were committed. So how did they hang men in the treeless prairie? They unhitched two wagons and raised the two ends of them together, securing an attached rope to the tongues. Shaken after the... So if you think about what's happening in this episode, of course, Captain Brennan is the wagon boss, the wagon master, if you will. But as the article that I just read said, there also was some type of importance placed on someone who was a respected figure. And Joseph, being the only interpreter in the group, was viewed as a de facto leader in Brennan's eyes because he was the only one that understood both sides. And because of that, you see Brennan trying to turn Joseph into more of a leader. And this is important for a few reasons. Of course, Joseph is not a seasoned wagon master or expert on what's going on in the American West, but he does have the ear of his people and he can speak to them. So Brennan wants him to become more trusted by the immigrants, because then if Joseph has that authority, not only will it make it smoother for when Brennan needs anything, but also if Brennan were to die or anything were to happen to him, then Joseph might have the experience in leading to carry out the rest of the trail. So fascinating article, and obviously the folks at 1883 really thought through what Western justice, I guess, looked like on the prairie, and of course Banished, as we see, they banished the folks that were stealing food. Of course, the scary thing about this is that you do make enemies when you do that, and there was a pretty interesting story about how there was a disagreement within the Donner Party, which of course became famous for getting lost just as they were making it to California, and many of them froze to death, and cannibalism occurred and all kinds of things. But they had actually banished a couple, and that couple actually made it to California successfully without them. So banishment was not necessarily a death sentence, but it was a rejection of our society, and it really limited your success and increased your risk of dying, because of course, again, you're losing your strength in numbers. So in another part of the show, of course, we see that there's the budding relationship between Ennis and Elsa. I won't spend too much time on that. Of course, not too much history going on there. There were young couples that did get married on the trail. And always people were looking for a cause for celebration, or reprieve from the daily skullduggery, if you will, of living life on the trail. So of course we see that the Dutton family is increasing with the addition of Ennis as Elsa marries him, but of course it's a short marriage, because unfortunately we get back to the realities of this episode, and that is of course the Fangs of Freedom. So the wagon train does learn that they are being followed by thieves, and they actually use Joseph and his wife, Risa, as bait for these men to come and attack their wagon. And, it seemed like these thieves, if you will, were almost kind of like vultures or coyotes, right? They weren't going to attack in numbers against a well-defended wagon train. They were going to wait for a straggler to fall behind and to prey upon. And so this was the perfect setup for them. So, of course, when they head towards the decoy wagon, they get shot at by not only Joseph and Risa, who are trying to protect their wagon that is the decoy, but then also the men of the group come out, Dutton and Brennan and Thomas, and get into a firefight. But of course, similar to when we found our characters in episode 1 and 2 near the river, the bandits make their way into camp, and that's when the firefight gets a little bit more dangerous and deadly for our protagonists. And of course, Ennis gets shot in the chest as one of the bandits starts to get away. But then there is a moment of, fascinating story, interesting TV, if you will, where Elsa actually takes her pistol out of her saddlebag that her father had given her and executes the gentleman who is in custody who had killed Ennis. And, it's kind of viewed as the moment where Elsa's childishness is removed. And, she says something so interesting in this. She says, that her eyes were blinded that day, and now she sees the world through the eyes of her mother. And so, this episode is absolutely fantastic from a philosophical and historical perspective, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So I really like the name of this episode, the Fangs of Freedom, for a few reasons. It seems like between the beginning with the tragedy at the river and the end with the tragedy of the attack of the outlaws, there's really quite the beautiful metaphor in your mind that you think this story is really happening between two jaws. Just like the fangs on a wolf, we find ourselves always precariously between tragedies throughout the show. And, I think that this is most likely going to be the most philosophical episode of the series. Obviously, there's lots to be thought of later on when they get closer to Oregon and, the story that transpires there that we'll get into in future episodes. But there's just so much interesting information brought up about what life was like back then and why people valued and took the risks that they did to try and get out west. And, I don't think that we see TV shows that contemplate freedom in this way these days. It's typically not something that our media likes to do. Instead, we see a lot of escapism occurring in TV. And even though sometimes that escapism comes through darkness, you think of the series Breaking Bad, where we have a anti-hero, if you will, in Walter White. There's still something idyllic about the making the money and trying to provide for your family and all this, whereas there's nothing idyllic about what's going on with the Duttons, right? Death is occurring all around, and we're really having to grapple with, is this trip worth it? And of course, if you're a fan of the Yellowstone series, you'll probably say, of course it was worth it. They end up in paradise, and their family becomes a wildly successful ranching family. But it's not that clear cut obviously, to our main characters that this is the right thing to do. And as I mentioned earlier, Elsa puts it so beautifully when she says that she was blinded and that she's starting to see through the eyes of someone much more experienced, like, her parents, her mother. And it kind of reminds me of that insurance commercial where they talk about you always turn into your parents. And it's goes back to what I was saying earlier. We truly aren't very different from our ancestors. We experience the same problems. We do have more access to knowledge than they did. But at the end of the day, I mean, your experience only goes as far as those before you that you're willing to take in. And so if, you don't read history, if you don't learn from history, if you just live your life, then you might live a life not too far off from the earliest peoples. And, it's a fascinating thing to think about. And I know this is typically a historical show, but I think what you should take from episode 5 is that we should all contemplate what our comfort level is in our society, and try and live in a way that, not only honors our freedom, but also honors the mistakes and sacrifices and other things of our ancestors, which is what I like to always go back to at the end of these episodes when I'm talking about 1883, because, of course, we're learning the story of these German immigrants and Austrian immigrants and the Duttons. But if you're American, or even if you're not American, I mean, so many countries today are full of immigrants from all over the world, and it's likely that somebody in your family immigrated to where you were today. And I think this show is quite the beautiful celebration of the immigrant story. So I want to thank you again, of course, for listening in on the Rancher podcast. Of course, we'll have more episodes out soon about the 1883 series, and also I'll continue my Legendary Ranchers series and Legendary Horses series. But if you have any input, I'd love to hear it. I have started uploading a lot of my podcast episodes to YouTube. I plan on also adding videos to YouTube. I go to a lot of rodeos. I have one up right now about the Austin Rodeo, which I went to last month, and look forward to continuing to bring more content there. So please, if you would, find The Rancher on YouTube and subscribe. The bigger my podcast gets on YouTube, of course, then I will be able to continue to bring more content. So if that's a venue or avenue that you would like me to pursue, please, like, subscribe, comment, all those things, and that will help me tell if you like the videos or if you want me to stick to podcasting. So I really appreciate your time today, and of course, until next time, God bless and Godspeed.